Today we're going to speak about the Puranas. The word Purana in Sanskrit means ancient, and this is a type of literature which ultimately became extremely popular in India, and it's very big. I mean, Puranas, typically like Deities, we talked about Mahabharata and Ramayana, and in the textbook, for those of you who religiously studied it, the Itihasa and Purana, which is basically Ramayana and Mahabharata, are concerned with Dharma, according to the textbook, and the Puranas are concerned with different kinds of bhakti traditions, typically bhakti devotion toward Krishna, or Rama, or Shiva, Shakti, the goddess, and so on. And these literatures are very similar, although they have different names and they are, in a sense, different genres, but there's a tremendous amount of overlap. So that, for example, Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is basically tells about the descent, the avatar, the incarnation of Krishna in this world, his great devotees, the Pandavas. But then the Bhagavad Purana, which is by far the most important, the single most important Purana, most famous Purana, is all about Krishna too. And there's a lot of the same stories, and it's in many ways the same worldview. Or, for example, you have the Ramayana, the other great Itihasa, but then the Bhagavad Purana also has a short version of the Ramayana. In fact, many of the Puranas tell the Ram story. So there's somewhat different approaches, but there's a whole bunch of material where, for all anyone knows, it could be a Purana, it could be an Itihasa. Although they are different, they do have certain characteristics, but they really are very much like twin literatures. They share a lot of stories. Even the meter, the Sanskrit is written metered verse, the poetics are very similar, the worldview is basically in many ways the same. There's some differences, but it's definitely the same culture, the same worldview. Now, how old are the Puranas? That's a very tricky question because, as I mentioned before, and I'll say it again, there were certain kinds of literature in India, sacred literatures, where the actual physical sound itself, the actual consonants and vowels, have the power. And I gave the example, I've given the example many times that there was a great sacrifice where Twashta, this celestial sage, he was supposed to chant Indra Shatru, which means the mortal enemy of Indra, to produce some powerful being that would kill Indra, who had killed his son. But he mispronounced one accent, just misplaced one accent. Instead of saying Indra Shatru, he said Indra Shatru. I don't know, maybe he hiccuped or something. And the result was, instead of creating this creature that would be the mortal enemy of Indra, he created a creature for whom Indra would be the mortal enemy. So Indra knocked him out in 10. Anyway, so the idea was that in these old Veda Samhitas, it was the actual sound, so the sound was memorized, it was never changed. When you changed it, you lost the power. Whereas in the stories, in the Bhakti tradition, it didn't matter that much because it was the story that counted. It was the knowledge, the wisdom, the poetry. And therefore, in those traditions, people didn't always memorize exactly a certain version of it because they just kept telling the story. For example, we can do a modern adaptation of Shakespeare, and we may or may not use Shakespeare's English, but it'll be the same story. And in a sense, a lot of people are just interested in the story, so there are many adaptations. So anyway, how old are these Puranas? There's a statement in our textbook that the oldest Puranas were probably compiled around the 4th century of the Common Era. The problem with that date is that the stories themselves, many of them are much, much, much older. We have evidence of that in a sense. Because in the, let's say, going back to a much earlier genre, which is the Upanishads, the two oldest Upanishads, according to mainstream scholarship, the two oldest Upanishads are the Brihadaranyaka, the Great Aranyaka Upanishad, and the Chandogya. And both of those Upanishads talk about Puranas. So that means thousands of years ago, long, long before this date of the 4th century common era, there were Puranas and Itihasas. So exactly what was in there, we don't know, and no one knows. And no one really knows from the academic perspective. So you can read a Purana, which is dated, let's say, to the 4th century or 5th or 7th century, the Common Era. But when you're reading a story, that story may be thousands of years older. And no one can say it isn't. No one really knows. So the actual date is really sort of vanishes into the sort of proto-historical horizon, you may say. So it's really impossible to date. It's just very, very old. So any questions on that so far? It's a little introduction. The Puranas are very big. Like, to give an example, the Bhagavad Purana has about 18,000 verses. Typically, the size of these Puranas, there are 18 major Puranas. 18 major Puranas. These 18 are divided into 3 sets of 6, corresponding to the 3 modes or qualities, the 3 gunas of nature. The idea being, for those in goodness, for those in the highest quality of nature, they have their Puranas. Because, birds of a feather. So people who, let's say, are in goodness, virtuous, Brahminical, wise, and so on, their interests will not be the same as those, let's say, in the lowest quality of ignorance. So in the lowest quality, people want a lot of sex and violence. And in the higher quality, people may actually want a little more philosophy interspersed with their sex and violence. So, take movies. Take movies. When people make movies, they aim at a particular niche. Some movies are aimed at the base of the social pyramid, let us say. There are certain movies where they're just going for the lowest common denominator. And there are art movies, and there are even some foolhardy directors and producers that try to appeal to intellectuals or something. So, but there are different market niches. People shoot for different markets when they make movies. And in the same way, the Puranas, there were 6 Puranas going for the different guna markets. The guna of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So those are the 18 great Puranas. They're called Mahapuranas. Great because they're big and they're culturally predominant. Then there are Upa Puranas, junior Puranas, you might say. Lots of those are just because people told lots of stories in India. Anyway, just one little linguistic note that may amuse you. We have the Sanskrit word upa, which means like approximate, less than, near but not as good, a little less than something else. So you have an Upa Purana, like a junior Purana. This word Upa, there's a Greek form of this word, which is this. The Greeks did not pronounce the H at the beginning of a word, and the Y is sort of like a French or German umlaut U. So this word is actually Upal, which is Sanskrit Upa, hypo in English. Like, for example, hypothermia, which means too little heat, not enough heat. Anyway, that's it. That was a linguistic note. So, anyway, those are the junior Puranas, the Upa Puranas. So, here are some quotes from our book. There's one quote from the book. Actually, the author kind of kept using over and over again the word sectarian. Because in mainstream scholarship, and just want to warn you about this, in mainstream scholarship, whenever a religious tradition focuses on a particular deity, like we think Vishnu is Lord or Shiva is Lord, or in other traditions, Christianity, Judaism, scholars in a very flattering way call this sectarian. They call this sectarian. So any specific religious claim, if you just say that God is the one, or it's the all, or something like that, that's considered to be philosophical. But if you make a specific claim that this particular figure is God, then they call that sectarian. Here are some examples from our book from page 188. Sectarian scriptures developed in tandem with the Shaiva, Vaishnava, and Shakta sects. That means sectarian scriptures, Puranas devoted to Shiva, Vishnu, and Shakti. Here's another quote. Puranas are classified along sectarian lines. Other Puranas do not lend themselves to such sectarian classifications. So this word was used 3 times on this page. Now, growing up as I did outside an academic milieu, I always thought the word sectarian was actually pejorative. And yet scholars have chosen this word. There's a whole history of sort of an academic bias against religion, which has improved somewhat back in the 60s. Social science kind of declared war on religion. You can study this in the intellectual history of Europe and America, where at a certain point there was an explicit formal view that religion was a sort of a somewhat primitive, pre-philosophical, pre-scientific state of consciousness, and the purpose of scholarship was to gradually wean people off this somewhat delusional, mythological way of seeing things and bring them to a scientific, rational, humanistic picture of reality. Now, things have gotten better in the last several decades. Scholars aren't quite as silly as they were back then. But there's still some of the remnants of this antagonism. I mean, anyway, I won't go into the whole history of academics, but it's quite a solid point I'm making. So, some of the remnants of this animosity toward religion. For example, I grew up in California. And in the 60s in California, at the University of California, you could form a student club for anything, like to advocate anything in favor or against anything except religion. In other words, you could have an atheist society. You could have an agnostic society. You could have anything, but religious societies were actually illegal. And the Supreme Court threw that out because it was obviously an infringement of free speech. So it took the Supreme Court to step in and restrain some of these major universities who did have actually an explicit animosity toward religion. That's a whole history. But the word sectarian. So I just want to give you some standard definitions of the word sectarian because it occurred 3 times on one page in our textbook, specifically to describe people who make a specific claim like this is God. And so here's a quote from an old friend of mine, Francis Clooney, who's now sort of holds the big Hinduism chair at Harvard. He's actually a Jesuit. Really nice guy. Anyway, so this is a quote from an article he wrote. Contemporary scholars are frequently skeptical and even dismissive of the theological interpretations with which the Vedantins invested the Upanishads. So here's the Cambridge Advanced Learner's Dictionary. Sectarian is mainly disapproving. It means someone who is not willing to accept other beliefs. A sectarian murder. That's an example of how the word sectarian is commonly used. A sectarian murder. He called on terrorists on both sides of the sectarian divide to end the cycle of violence. Now, it comes from the word sect, which is, quote, usually disapproving. A religious group which has developed from a larger religion and is considered to have extreme or unusual beliefs or customs. When he was 16, he ran away from home and joined a religious sect. And here's from Merriam-Webster. Sectarian means limited in character or scope. Excuse me, parochial. Another standard dictionary. Narrowly confined or devoted to a particular sect. Narrowly confined or limited in interest. A bigoted or narrow-minded adherent of a sect is a sectarian. A bigoted, this is the neutral academic term used to describe theism. Okay, anyway, I'll stop after a minute. We won't spend the rest of the class going over these definitions. But just a couple more, just so you'll never forget it. The American Heritage Dictionary, adhering or confined to the dogmatic limits of a sect or denomination, partisan, narrow-minded, parochial, characterized by bigoted adherence to a factional viewpoint, etc., etc. Sectarian killings is an example of the word. So, anyway, this incredibly neutral word is the word that people in academics standardly, is that a word? Yeah. Use to describe theism. In other words, groups of people that believe that they have specific knowledge of the nature of God. This is the neutral word they use. So, no questions on that? So now in the Puranas, a few things I wanted to talk about regarding the content of the Puranas. The topics, they have these typical lists of like what's in a Purana. Sarga, which means the creation of the cosmos, cosmogony in other words. Pratisarga, subsequent creations, because after the original creation, then, there's fine-tuning and new species and new worlds and things like that. Manvantaras, sort of the governance of humanity by higher beings. The dynasties of rishis, sages, and demigods, and kingly dynasties. So those are the 5 topics. The most famous Purana is the Bhagavad Purana. And in this Bhagavad Purana, to give you an example, it's there have been more translations in European languages than all the other Puranas combined. It's just a very dominant text. And the word Bhagavat is from the word Bhagavan. If you remember the Bhagavad Gita, I'm sure you remember Bhagavad Gita, so from the Sanskrit word Bhagavan, which means Lord, you have the word Bhagavata, which means about the Lord or of the Lord. So it's the Bhagavad Purana. And the most famous part of this Purana is the 10th book, which is the story of the life of Krishna. And also another thing which is really just absolutely captured the imagination of Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism for that matter. It was so popular. Everyone was into it. Was the avatars especially of Krishna. As I mentioned before, if you study the different sectarian traditions in India, such as the worship of Shiva and the worship of Vishnu and so on, although they all had followers, the most popular one, the most influential, although they're all important, was the Vaishnava, and especially worship of Krishna. And there are 10 avatars of Krishna. I thought I'd go over these because it gives a very different picture of God. It gives a very different picture of God than we'd be used to in the Judeo-Christian tradition. A God who is typically majestic, kingly, dangerous, given to incredibly severe punishment under certain circumstances. A jealous God, and often depicted as sort of an elderly father figure. On the other hand, what you have in Krishna, the Krishna avatars, first of all, you have a concept of God as being young, actually God being a child, which is somewhat a different take on things. That although God is in Sanskrit, the Adi Purusha, the original person, the primeval, or the origin of everything, and yet God is eternally a child. God is eternally youthful. And so it's not so much that God plays like a child in an incarnation, it's actually that the child plays like God. In other words, the God of religion, the God of human religion, a majestic God before whom we tremble, you might say, and for whom you feel great reverence, the Holy of Holies. That God is actually the child assuming that role as the God of religion simply because human beings on earth are inclined to think of God that way. But ultimately, if you get past all these layers, ultimately there is an eternal youth. There's an eternal youth, an eternal child who is the source of everything. And that God that the child is infinitely beautiful and infinitely charming. And so Krishna ultimately is, among all the different avatars, among all the different conceptions and images of God, is generally the one who is most enchanting, charming, beautiful, and so on. Krishna plays a flute, and it's said that when he plays this flute, that all moving things, like people, are stunned and can't move, and all unmoving things like stones melt in ecstasy, and even birds sort of stop in the air. So the idea is that this infinitely charming youth is actually the source of everything, and the speaker of the Bhagavad Gita. So, to show you how far out, so to speak, sort of a non-technical theological term, far out, Krishna is, there are 10 famous avatars. This is very, very famous in Hinduism. It's like everyone knows this, and kids all read comic books about this in Hinduism. So let's see. Dasha, you like the English word decimal, 10. So the Sanskrit word dasha means 10. So the Dashavatara. There are many famous songs about this, and movies, and plays, and it's just a big thing in Hinduism. These 10 avatars, these 10 incarnations of Krishna. It's a major part of Hinduism. And so what they are, they're these, I'll just very briefly go over these 10 stories, and then Wednesday, if we're all still around, we'll talk more about the Bhagavad Purana specifically in the life of Krishna. But these 10 avatars, these 10 incarnations of Krishna came as a fish. I think of it sort of like as the supreme divine surfer. The idea is that according to the cosmology, Hindu cosmology, and again, Buddhism and Jainism, they're on board with all this mostly. I mean, everyone tells these stories. Everyone kind of shares the basic cosmology. The idea is that there are periodic devastations, so that there's Creator Brahma, and during his day, the creation takes place. And then at night, it's kind of like everything is dissolved, or everything is destroyed. And then in another day of Brahma, everything is created again. This is described in the Gita. Then finally, at the end of, several hundred trillion years, the universe is just totally withdrawn. So the basic cosmology is the universe comes out, actually many universes, there's innumerable universes. The universes come out, and then within a particular universe, there are cycles of creation and destruction corresponding to the days and nights of the Creator Brahma, who's not God with a capital G, but who is a highly placed government servant, you might say, within the universe. So the idea is that often the destructions, when it's the nighttime of Brahma and the creation is being destroyed, it takes place by water. There's pralaya, sort of a dissolution by water, great floods. And of course, there are flood stories in many other traditions. So anyway, it's said that once, when there was such a great flood and many of the planets, the galaxies, whatever, were being destroyed, there was danger that actually the Vedas themselves, the sacred texts, were going to be lost in this flood. And there was a king, Satyavrata, who prayed to the Lord, and the Lord came as this gigantic fish. And basically, he put the king and the Vedas in this boat, and then tied the boat to himself, and he sort of surfed the waves of annihilation, which are the biggest waves in the universe, really. I mean, better than Hawaii or anything. So, the interesting thing about this is, who would do this? If you think about it, it's something a child might do, to take the form of a fish, and you have these waves, maybe millions of miles high, these huge cosmic waves, and just, have fun. Save the Vedas at the same time. So the kind of God you get here is very playful, sense of humor, having a good time. And then so that's the fish. And again, in Hinduism, everyone knows these stories. Then there's another incarnation as a tortoise. Again, very playful. The idea was that the gods and the demons were churning the ocean of milk. There's an ocean of milk. High cholesterol, but anyway, there's an ocean of milk somewhere in the universe, according to Hinduism, and they had this big churning rod, and they used Vasuki, this celestial serpent, as a rope, and the gods held the tail, and the demons held the head, and they just churned. They put a mountain, the Mundra mountain, and so the Lord came as a tortoise, and there's even like a joke that it's because he had his back was itching, so he put this big mountain on his back, and then they had they were whirling this mountain on his back. Anyway, so the Krishna came as a tortoise, and then out of this milk ocean came all kinds of celestial products and different cosmic elements. That's a very famous story, the churning of the ocean of milk, which is mentioned in probably most of the Puranas, and it's mentioned in the Mahabharata. It's just one of the classic stories. And then there's the dwarf. Krishna came as this very beautiful little child, very little child. The idea was that there was a king named Bali who would always give charity to the Brahmins, but he was sort of on the demon side, and he conquered Indra. He conquered the Lord of Heaven, took over heaven. And so Krishna came as this little child, this little sort of miniature Brahmin child. He walked into Bali's court and said, "I'm a Brahmin, give me charity." So Bali was very proud of his charity. He said, yes, of course, I'll give you whatever you want. So this little child said, give me 3 steps of land. And the king, being proud, he just conquered heaven, said, hey, I can give you much more than that. I mean, don't just ask me for 3 steps of land. So the child said, no, just give me 3 steps of land and I'll be satisfied. This, by the way, is one of the most famous stories of Vishnu. It's actually in the Rig Veda talks about this. So, and then Bali's guru. Bali had a guru named Dr. White, Shukracharya, Dr. White in Sanskrit. And so Dr. White told his client king, Bali, don't give this child anything. He's asking for 3 steps of land, but this is actually Vishnu, and who knows what he's going to do. But the king was so attracted to this child, and that's a very common feature of these stories, that people, no matter what their prior commitments are, when they see Krishna in his different forms, they become so attracted by his beauty that they just forget what their game plan was and end up giving Krishna what he wants and ultimately being saved. So anyway, so the guru, Dr. White, Shukracharya, insisted, but the king refused him and said, no, I will not reject Vishnu. If this is actually Vishnu in the form of a child, all the more reason to give him what he wants. So this story is given as an example of rejecting a false guru. The idea is that even though in this culture there's so much respect given to the guru, because this guru told his disciple to reject Vishnu, that the disciple instead rejected the guru. So this is sort of like the great lesson which is told in this regard. So anyway, so the king made his decision that I will give 3 steps of land to this child, even if he is Vishnu. So then the child thanked him and then began to take his 3 steps. And it says that with his first step, his leg began to expand and basically covered half the universe with 1 step. And people were thinking, oh my God. So then he, with his second step, he covered the other half of the universe. And then he went back to the king and said, excuse me, but you promised me 3 steps of land. And there's no more land, so you didn't fulfill your promise. So, of course, at that point, Bali, seeing that this was actually Vishnu, he surrendered in devotion, and because although he's from the Asura, demonic community, he actually had devotion for Vishnu. And so he said, there's one place left for your 3rd step. He said, put your 3rd step on my head, because I now surrender you. So then Vishnu accepted him, and Bali became a very famous Vaishnava, very famous devotee of Vishnu. So that form of Krishna, or Vishnu, is called Vamana, and also Tri Vikrama, or simply Vikrama or Urukrama. These are very famous names of Vishnu. They're used a lot. They're used in the Rig Veda, the oldest literature, and in other earlier Vedic literature. Krama in Sanskrit means a step, and V basically, probably cognate means wide, a wide step, and this is 3 wide steps. So because Vishnu, in the form of Vamana, took these 3 wide steps, he's called Tri Vikrama, or Vikrama, or Urukrama, which also means great or wide. Anyway, that's a story which goes all the way back to the oldest Sanskrit literature. The name is there, Vikrama. The story of Vamana. That's another incarnation. Then Narahari, man-lion. Another very famous one. This is the incarnation which Vaishnavas, to whom Vaishnavas always pray for protection. It's a specific form of Krishna that's always prayed to for protection at times of danger. The Sanskrit is Narahari, which just means man-lion, or Narasingha, which also means man-lion. You know, Singapore, Lion City, anyway, man-lion. So this story, very briefly, is that there was... Did I tell this story already in this class? No. Okay. Didn't want to do a rerun here. In this story, there was a sort of like the quintessential classic demon, Hiranyakashipu. Have you ever heard of that old James Bond movie, Goldfinger? Well, this is Goldcushion. Hiranyakashipu was one of the central ideas in all Indian religions, really. Certainly the Shramana movements and the yoga movements and everything. One of the central ideas is that by tapas, by austerity, by asceticism, one gains power. This is just a very central idea. It's in all the literatures and all the religious traditions. The idea is that asceticism, austerity, going to the forest, meditating, self-abnegation brings power. And so Hiranyakashipu was a demonic guy, and he performed the most severe asceticism imaginable. In fact, it said he fasted to the point where, you've heard, I don't know if you've, from yoga, you've heard of prana. Prana is the vital energy, the life breath inside of you, the prana. And so it said that he performed such austerities, fasted so much, there was nothing left of his body but his skeleton. And somehow or other, his soul, he kept his prana, this vital air, circulating within his bones. There was nothing else left. So this is like going all the way with yoga asceticism. Anyway, he performed such severe austerities, over the top, that finally, this is a very typical scenario. It's almost always like this. Brahma, the creator, according to the rules of the universe, like he's got to follow the rules, because this person performed such austerities, Brahma had to come and grant him whatever boon he wanted. So Hiranyakashipu wanted to be immortal within this universe. He wanted to conquer the universe and rule it forever. In other words, he wanted to be God. So he asked Brahma for immortality, and then Brahma, the creator, said, I'm really sorry about that, but there is no immortality within this universe. Even I am not immortal. Even I, the creator, ultimately die when the universe is finished. So Hiranyakashipu was thinking, rats. So then he thought, okay, I'll get this another way. So he thought, bend the rules, loopholes, whatever. He said, grant me that I will never die during day or night. And Brahma said, yes, you can have that. Grant me that I will never die inside or outside of any house or building. Yes, he said, I'll grant you that. And then he said, grant me that I will never be killed by any man or animal or by any god or demon. So he said, yes, I can grant you that. So he granted him this series of boons, which Hiranyakashipu, Gold Cushion, figured it all adds up to the same. I'm immortal for all practical purposes. So then Hiranyakashipu began to terrorize the universe, defeated Indra, took over, and was, ruling the universe. The dark side of the force had completely taken over. And at that point, the demigods typically were praying to Vishnu, praying to God, like, get us out of this mess. So then, typical thing, Krishna, or Vishnu, wanted to preserve the boons given by Brahma, because Brahma is supposed to be representing Vishnu. He's serving God. And therefore, since one of his authorized agents gave this boon, he thought, well, I'll keep the boon intact, but I'll still get this guy. So anyway, this is how it happened. This is how the story played out. Hiranyakashipu had a son named Prahlad, who was one of the most famous saints in Hinduism. Prahlad, whoops, it's an L. Anyway, this boy Prahlad was not a demon, as his father fondly hoped he would be, but actually was a great Vaishnava. It said that even when Prahlad was in the womb of his mother, the sage Narada used to teach the boy the Bhagavatam, even when the child was in the womb of his mother. So anyway, the father sent his child to the school, and during recess, when the teachers were gone, the child would get up in front of the class and teach everyone to chant the names of Krishna. It's like in the Plaza of the Americas. So, Plaza of the Demons. So the father found out that his child, instead of being a good, precocious little fiend, was actually teaching Vaishnavism to his playmates. So the father was outraged because Hiranyakashipu knew that if anyone could ever threaten him, it was Vishnu, and so he considered Vishnu his mortal enemy. And in fact, Vishnu had killed Hiranyakashipu's brother, Hiranyaksha, Goldeye, because Goldeye, well, you'll hear about him. He actually dealt with another avatar. He was another big cosmic demon who was causing havoc. Anyway, so Hiranyakashipu hated Vishnu, and when he heard that his own child had become a devotee of Vishnu, he just couldn't stand it. So finally, seeing that he couldn't reform his child, he decided to kill his own child. So he tried in every possible way to murder this he was a 5-year-old boy, Prahlad, but Vishnu kept saving him. He threw his son off a cliff, and it said that Vishnu arranged the boy sort of landed like a feathers. And they tried to poison his child, and the child just digested the poison, wasn't affected. He tried to have the child trampled by elephants, but the elephants wouldn't touch him. Anyways, he tried every possible way to kill the child, didn't work. Finally, in a rage, frustrated, clearly Hiranyakashipu had an anger management problem. So he finally called his child into the palace, and in a rage he said, "Where do you get this power that I can't kill you?" Because again, this is Hiranyakashipu. He can't kill this 5-year-old boy. So the child said, well, the child gave him a philosophical reply and said, well, I get my power from the same source that you get your power, from Vishnu, because after all, everything comes from Vishnu. He's the Vedantic source of everything. So then Hiranyakashipu said, oh yeah, basically, he said, where is your God? Where is Vishnu? And then Prahlad again gave him a philosophical answer. Well, Vishnu is all-pervading, so he's everywhere. So then the gold cushion said, he said, is he in the pillar of this palace? He turned to a pillar, and Prahlad looked and said, yeah, he's there. Because Prahlad was this self-realized soul that could see God everywhere. So finally, Hiranyakashipu said that I'll kill Vishnu. Vishnu's there, so he took out a sword, he struck the pillar of the palace, and then there was this great scene, it needs to be a good movie of it, this great roaring sound, the whole world was shaking, and then Vishnu came out in this form of half man, half lion, the body of a man, and the head of a lion, and the claws of a lion, because Hiranyakashipu had a boon, he wouldn't be killed by a man or animal, etc., so he's half man, half lion. He wouldn't be killed in day or night, so it was twilight, it wasn't day or night. He couldn't be killed inside or outside of anything, so it took place at the threshold of the palace, which wasn't inside or outside the palace. So, preserving all the boons, Vishnu came to save his devotee. Anyway, the great fight ensued, and Hiranyakashipu lost. Finally, Vishnu took him on his lap and bifurcated him. So it's interesting because Vishnu, this form, Narahari, was raging, and so it said even the gods were afraid to approach him because this form of Vishnu was so ferocious. So they said to Prahlad, you go talk to him because, he came for you. So then the little child approached, it said as soon as the child approached this form, Narahari, he immediately became peaceful and loving toward his devotee. And then he insisted that Prahlad take a boon. He said, I'll give you anything you desire. So Prahlad said that he had no desire, that seeing Vishnu, he had no further desire, nothing to wish for. So when the Lord insisted, finally Prahlad said that if I must take a boon, then I ask you to please give salvation to my father. So the father was saved. Happy endings. Anyway, that is a very famous story, which is, again, it's a story that every Hindu knows, basically. And it's particularly this form of Narahari that people pray to for protection. There's one part of India, Andhra Pradesh, sort of southeast India, where there are many temples to Narahari. And so typically on altars, devotional altars, where they may worship, say, Radha, Krishna, or even Ram, that there'll be some kind of form or picture of Nrsimha, which is especially for protection, in a hairy situation. So that's another very famous avatar, one of the great avatars of Vishnu. And Parashuram, very briefly, Parashu means an axe, the one who sort of took pleasure with his axe. The idea is that long, long ago, the warriors rebelled against the Brahmins, actually began to kill the Brahmins. And so in a Brahmin family, Vishnu appeared as Parashuram and wiped out the rebellious kings and restored the sacred social order. Then, let's see, boar. This is actually a boar, as in hog. I mean, it's very funny. I mean, it definitely has this comic element. That, again, Vishnu, child playing, comes as the brother of Gold Cushion was Hiranyaksha, and he was causing havoc in the world. So, in fact, it said he took the earth and threw it into the netherworld of the universe. And so Krishna, playing, came as a boar and just scooped it out of this plutonic region, you could say. And then this great battle took place in outer space between Hiranyaksha, it was like this giant demon, and the boar. And they were fighting, and finally, again, Krishna playing as a boar, as a fish, as a tortoise, half man, half lion, just having a great time and doing good for the universe. So that's Lord Boar. Another incarnation, of course, is Rama, the hero of the Ramayana. The Ramayana, that's another avatar. Balaram is Krishna's brother. When Krishna appeared, according to the Indian tradition, 5,000 years ago, when Krishna appeared, his brother was Balaram, also an avatar of Vishnu, Krishna's brother. And then Buddha, of course. We've mentioned that at a certain point in Indian history, the Vaishnava community formally recognized Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu because of all the good he had done. They accepted that he must have been directly empowered by the Lord, and that was influential in Indian religious history because there were a number of Buddhist temples that sort of converted and became Vaishnava temples. They thought, well, if you accept Buddha, we accept you. So, and that sort of like capped a long trend where Buddhism was coming back to Hinduism anyway. So Buddha is accepted as an avatar of Vishnu, and Kalki. I don't know if you've heard this word Kalki. It sort of enters the culture. Kalki is an avatar who will come in the future, according to the tradition. Remember the yugas, the four yugas? Satya Yuga, the age of truth, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, Kali Yuga. This is the Kali Yuga, the age of quarrel, hypocrisy, where everything just goes to hell. And so it's said that thousands, long time in the future, when this age has become completely degraded, and there's no more dharma left on the earth, there's nothing like spirituality or religion left on the earth. It really is human beings like dog eat dog. There's just nothing pious or virtuous left on earth. At that time, it said Kalki will come. This avatar Kalki will come riding on a horse with a sword, and he will basically remove the hopelessly degraded population of the earth who will oppose him. Actually, the people will fight. Those who are left on the earth will fight against him, oppose him. They lose, he wins. And that's the end of the Kali Yuga. And then a new Satya Yuga comes. That will be the end of this Kali Yuga, and Kalki will, so to speak, usher in the next age of truth. It'll be then another golden age. So these 10 avatars are actually given in a very famous song by Jayadeva Goswami called Gita Govinda. It's one of the great poetic works of Indian history, really. It's one of the most studied. It's always studied whenever people study classical Indian poetry and religious literature. Anyway, so he gives these 10 avatars. They all end. He sings these hymns to the 10 avatars, and all the verses end with the words Jaya Jagadisha Hare, which means sort of like Jai, like victory to Hari, the name of Krishna, the Lord of the universe. And if you go to any Hindu function, every Hindu function I've ever been to, and I've been to quite a few, at a certain point they will sing this song, Jaya Jagadisha Hare. You must have heard it. Jaya Jagadisha Hare. And that comes actually from Jayadev's song to these 10 avatars. So any questions on that? Yes?
I think the book of Vishnu avatars
Yes.
actually lists Krishna as one of the incarnations. But
Right.
I noticed that you pretty much interchange them when you talk about it. So is there really a distinction, or what? I'm just a little confused.
No, that was very perceptive on your part. Actually, there's sort of among Vaishnavas there are two different ways of looking at it. One is that, according to the Bhagavad Purana, and the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, that Krishna is actually the avatari, the origin of all the avatars, even Vishnu. And then there's another side of Vaishnavism which sees Krishna as an avatar of Vishnu. But everyone agrees that these are all different forms of the Lord. Everyone agrees on that. And yet they just sort of, sometimes they may disagree theologically on what the original form of God is. So the book sort of took one of those two views, taking it as the only view. But those on the other side, for example, quote the Bhagavad Gita, spoken by Krishna, where Krishna says, I am the source of everything, and all the avatars come from me. So from the Gita, another statement might come to that conclusion. Anyway, in the brief time we have, this is kind of like the heart of the Puranas, and these stories of the avatars are really, if anything is central, this is it.